When we read the four Gospels about the life of Jesus, his biography, we can divide it into four main chapters or four main subjects. The first is, of course, the stories about the nativity, the birth. It focuses mainly on the southern parts of the country, in the region of Bethlehem. And then comes the other period, childhood and adulthood. We know next to nothing about that from the Gospels. And then comes the third period, the period of ministry. The ministry focuses mainly on the Galilee, but also in other places such as Jericho, Jerusalem, and other places too. And finally, the last chapter is the story that takes place in Jerusalem. It's a story about the last week in the life of Jesus, his visit to Jerusalem, his preaching in the temple, sleeping at night on the Mount of Olives, and then his trial, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, and it all culminates in the ascension to heaven on the Mount of Olives. In this series, we're going to focus on the period of Jesus' ministry in the Galilee. Actually, here on the Mount of Beatitudes, we can have a beautiful view of the area in which the activity of Jesus focused during his ministry. Starting at Magdala, on the western side of the Kinneret or the Sea of Galilee, and ending at Kursi on the eastern side, the pagan side, the unclean side of the country, where pagans live. This is the site of the ministry. This is the territory. Here and there we go out of this area, for instance to Banyas, but it mainly focuses around this area. Unfortunately, you can't be here with me at the moment. So allow me to invite you to join me on a virtual tour in the footsteps of Jesus in the Galilee region during his ministry. Now, I'm going to take you on a trip to some of the main sites in the history of Christianity. We're going to explore them from different perspectives. The theological perspective, the historical, archaeological, and also sociological aspect. We'll learn about the different peoples who lived here, about the archaeology of these sites, and we will ask some questions, such as, are these sites that are venerated today by some Christians in this vicinity, are they authentic? Can we prove that they belong to they actually reflect the story of the time of Jesus? Maybe in some cases we can. In other cases, maybe it's questionable. It is a detective story, and eventually we will have all these pieces of the puzzle put together to reflect the stories of the Bible. So without further ado, let's go on a trip in the footsteps of Jesus in the Galilee. Welcome to the Mount of Beatitudes, north of the Kinneret. This is the traditional site of the Mount of Beatitudes, where the Sermon on the Mount took place. Let me read to you some of the verses. It begins with Jesus, who's in the vicinity of Capernaum, which isn't far away. And then it says in Matthew chapter 5, "Now, when he saw the crowd, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This story, the Sermon on the Mount, appears in two versions. One that I just read, it's just the beginning, it's a long sermon. And there's another one in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, which is a bit shorter. In both cases, there's a mountain involved, but in a different way. In Luke, it is explicitly said that Jesus stood on a plain when he preached. But in the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, it says he was on the mountainside. So, which way was it? Well, I do not have the authority to decide which version is more correct. Maybe both are correct in some way. But I can tell you that the feature here that appears in both cases is the mountain. It is clear from the story in Luke that Jesus spent the night on the mountain praying, and then he goes down, he sees the people, he sees the crowd, and he begins to preach. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's on the mountainside. He goes up to begin the sermon. Now, the mountain here plays a major role, of course. Why is that? I believe that it has a theological meaning. Because when we read the Sermon on the Mount, we see different issues addressed by Jesus. He speaks about salt and light, about murder, the fulfillment of the law, oaths, adultery, divorce, an eye for an eye, giving to the needy, fasting, prayer, and so on and so forth. Basically, it is, in a way, a second giving of the Torah. The Torah was given to the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. And here, in connection to a mountain, whether on the mountain or next to the mountain, Jesus is the second lawgiver. It seems to be that this is the main issue, regardless of the precise location of the event. Looking around us, we are next to Capernaum. We said that already. Capernaum is down below. In the story, it says that once Jesus finished preaching, he went to Capernaum. So the site should be located not too far from Capernaum. It should be a mountain. Well, we don't have really mountains here. We have hills. So, is there a hill here? Yes, of course. We are standing on one. Is this the true place? Maybe this one? Maybe the next hill? Probably not too far. However, having said that, there's another location suggested already in the 17th century. And some Christian denominations follow that identification even today. And this is the site of the Horns of Chittim, located above Tiberias. Now, that is a site venerated by some Christians, but others, of course, would come and venerate here. What do we have here? Let's take a look at it. One last word about the language. When we read the 8 verses, blessed and so on, 8 times, the English translation is blessed, but what was the original? Well, obviously, if you look at the Latin New Testament, it would be Beatus est, which is blessed. But Jesus did not speak Latin, probably. He was speaking to common people, to Jews. They spoke perhaps Aramaic, or even more probably Hebrew. So what would be the Hebrew origin of the blessed are? Some scholars speculate that the origin would be Ashrei. Now, Ashrei is a tricky word in Hebrew. Literally, it has to do with happiness, osher, but not in the mundane sense, of course. It is the spiritual happiness of someone who's chosen by God. So yes, blessed is a good translation, and the origin may have been Ashrei. Ashrei, wait a second, it's in the Bible. We find it in the book of Psalms many times. We find it in the scriptures of Qumran. Jews use this term. It's a common phrase. So that really shows us the Sitz im Leben, as they say in German, the surrounding, the culture from which Jesus came. He is a Jew. He is part of the Jewish culture, and when he expresses himself the way Jews expressed themselves in those days. And that goes well with the idea that the Sermon on the Mount is part of a second giving of the Jewish Torah. So here we are at the top of the Mount of Beatitudes. And if you look behind me, you can see a beautiful Catholic church. The site was purchased by the Franciscan Catholic Order in the end of the 19th century. And in 1938, after it was transferred to the possession of the National Italian Association, the site became the site of a church built by Antonio Barluzzi, one of the famous architects of the Italians in the Holy Land. He built so many churches in the land of Israel in those days. So in 1938 he builds this church, and if you look carefully you can see the shape of the church is quite odd. It is not a rectangular one, neither it is round. It is actually an octagonal church. It has 8 sides. Now this fact is quite interesting, as in the Byzantine era 8-sided churches were built in places where one would like to commemorate the remains of a saint, or perhaps the place where an interesting or important Christian story took place. So when you see such a structure in 1938 built here, you'd expect to find inside some ancient remains, perhaps of a saint, or, as I said, the exact spot where things happened according to Catholic tradition. However, this is not the case. This church is not built on ancient ruins because there are no ancient ruins here. The only ancient ruin is on the slopes of this mountain, and it is a ruin of a 4th century Byzantine period church, probably commemorating the same story. Here there's nothing. So why does it have an octagonal plan? The reason is quite simple. Remember the story of the Sermon on the Mount. 8 times Jesus says, "Blessed are." To reflect that in architecture, Barluzzi decided to choose the traditional octagonal plan and build this church according to that plan. So it's a traditional plan, but here it has a different meaning. There's lots more to say about the Mount of Beatitudes, its symbolism and much more. But this will suffice for now. Let me take you now to our next site.